Winter 2060 off the coast of Brittany. A thick layer of ice impedes all navigation. All along the French coastline, many ports remain closed, waiting for the icebreaker's intervention. And for the third time this year, most of Europe's airports have cancelled all flights, leaving thousands of planes grounded. From Norway to Spain, from Ireland to the Urals, all of Europe is affected by this unprecedented cold wave. Reality or fiction? These alarming predictions are part of a report recently commissioned by the American government, which seriously contemplates the breakdown of ocean currents and the European climate by the end of the 21st century. The cause of this disaster? Global warming. This foreseen catastrophe can be added to the litany of climatic accidents which have been multiplying over recent years. Torrential and devastating floods, deadly heat waves, increasingly frequent and violent hurricanes and typhoons. Enough examples to make us aware of the risk we run when we tamper with our climate. This time, the threat comes from the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, in the complexities of that most mythical of marine currents, the Gulf Stream. Saturday, December 31st on the Emerald Coast. With weather unfit to send a postman out into, even a retired one. But Jean-François Veillard, barely 1 week retired from the post office, is determined to venture out, and in his favorite uniform. Jean-François is a member of the Frigodems, amateur bathers who take to the sea in summer and winter alike, never missing an opportunity for a short swim in the Atlantic. A 20-minute dip, no matter what. This Sunday ritual would certainly be much harsher if it weren't for the relative mildness that bathes the Brittany coastline throughout the year. However, our retired postman has some notion of the current blessed by the gods that allows him to escape Sunday Mass.
C'est possible que ce soit grâce au Gulf Stream, qui passe quand même pas loin de Jersey, donc qui doit quand même réchauffer un peu les courants qui passent par là, quoi, à mon avis.
Mild winters, an ice-free sea, the passage of the warm Gulf Stream waters close to the Brittany coast explain in large part the famous microclimate touted in the region's tourist brochures. But one thing's for sure, there's no question of imitating the Frigodems on the other side of the Atlantic. Same time of year, same latitude. The Gulf of St. Lawrence on the Canadian coast, exactly across the Atlantic from the Bay of Dinard. In this early January, the temperature has dipped to minus 40 degrees and the thickness of the ice makes exiting Quebec Harbour a tricky business.
Northern Enterprise, déconseillé. C'est quand même assez clair. Il faudrait que vous gardiez le côté sud.
For 1 hour now, the icebreaker des Groseilliers has been labouring to free up the channel and the route out to sea. For many months to come, all ships plying the St. Lawrence will have to take this thick ice into account. And while the absence of the Gulf Stream may not be the only reason for these severe winters, its warm waters certainly would have altered the deal. Nevertheless, on their transatlantic voyage, these waters have quite simply ignored the Canadian shores. The Highlands on the northwest coast of Scotland. Latitude 57.8 degrees north. The same latitude as Hudson Bay, the kingdom of Canadian polar bears. It is to this barren and desolate place, the least hospitable in all of Britain, that the Gulf Stream has lovingly bestowed its most precious wedding gift.
This is a very interesting shrub, or large shrub, small tree. It's Euphorbia mellifera, and it comes from Madeira, places like that, and it's got this most beautiful, intoxicating smell. It smells like honey. This is Eucalyptus coccifera. You could almost imagine you was in Australia. As you can see there, we've got the Watsonias, which come from South Africa. Amazing to think we can grow Watsonias out. Beautiful.
Kevin Ball has one true passion, horticulture. And he's most fortunate indeed because he is in charge of one of Great Britain's most extraordinary gardens, the Inverewe Gardens. A botanical folly in the middle of nowhere, the Inverewe Gardens has assembled one of the richest collections of exotic plants in the world.
Although we are very north, we get the influence of the Gulf Stream, which brings warm waters, you know, up this way, and sort of warms the environment, so to speak. And it's because of that Gulf Stream we're allowed to grow these Australasian plants. If we got temperatures dropping down to below -3, -4, it would really be suffering at that degree.
But just what is this Gulf Stream? This benefactor that bathes the shores of northern Europe with its gentle warmth, protecting them from the severe winters that face their Canadian and American counterparts. There's a crowd this morning at Philadelphia's Constitution Center. Last month, an exhibition opened here commemorating the most important man in the history of the city and maybe even the country, Benjamin Franklin.
So here's the family. That's young Frankie, who died when he was 4, and William next to him.
In her guided tours, Paige Talbot is full of praise for this enlightened American. Franklin was not only a great inventor, and not just of the lightning rod, he was also the first ambassador of the United States to the court of the King of France, and one of the fathers of American independence. But the incident this admirer of the great man prefers to recount concerns an entirely different field.
The story of the Gulf Stream is probably one that most people don't know that very much about. People don't even know very much about what the Gulf Stream even is. So unless you are somebody who really knows about oceanography, perhaps you have no idea that Franklin had anything to do with discovering the Gulf Stream.
From time immemorial, the Gulf Stream has intrigued those navigators who crossed its path. American whalers in the early 18th century were the first to become aware of the path of this powerful current that traversed their fishing waters. Then, in 1769, when Ben Franklin was Deputy Postmaster General for the American colonies, the British authorities commissioned him to investigate why English ships crossing between Europe and America suffered delays of several weeks along the way. Franklin contacted a cousin, a former whaler in Nantucket. He consulted ship's logs and conducted experiments out at sea, all of which led him to discover the existence of a powerful current in the middle of the Atlantic.
Franklin realized that depending on the route that the ship captains took, sometimes it would take much longer to cross the Atlantic Ocean than others. And so it was working with his cousin, Timothy Folger, that he determined that there was this swiftly moving water, a stream, if you will, and he called it the Gulf Stream. And it was that stream of water that if you could get into the stream and allow it to propel you across the ocean,
Armed with his discoveries, Franklin set about plotting a precise chart of this river under the sea. And it was in Paris in 1785 that the very first representation of the Gulf Stream was finally published. A prized duplicate has been carefully preserved in Paris in the Department of Charts and Plans in the National Library of France. Department curator Hélène Richard continually marvels over the preciseness of Franklin's drawings.
L'une des raisons de la notoriété de cette carte, c'est le fait qu'elle n'ait pas été contredite sur le plan scientifique. Elle a été complétée, elle a été relativisée, mais elle n'a pas été contredite. La véracité de cette carte, la réalité de cette carte en a fait la notoriété.
According to Franklin, the Gulf Stream stopped somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. 2 centuries later, however, progress in oceanography enabled scientists to completely and accurately represent the surface of the ocean current. What we now call the Gulf Stream is a powerful surface current whose flow corresponds to 150 times the flow of all the Earth's rivers combined. Driven by the trade winds, its origins lie in the Gulf of Mexico, from which it gets its name. It carries the tropical waters from the Florida Strait to the Great Banks of the New World. The Gulf Stream then heads eastward, where it splits into several branches, one of which carries its warm waters to the borders of the North Atlantic. It is this North Atlantic drift that one commonly associates with the Gulf Stream, and which is largely responsible for the mildness of European winters. But the Gulf Stream's voyage has only just begun. As soon as the tropical waters hit the Arctic Ocean, they cool abruptly and plunge towards the abyssal zone to form a loop known as thermohaline circulation. Then, like an immense conveyor belt that slows down in the ocean depths, it sets out again southward to rejoin the beginning of the Gulf Stream off the American coast. Without these beautiful mechanics, the Invereux Gardens would be a barren moor flattened by winds, and the Breton frigodems would have to break through the ice for their wintertime swims. Don't miss this rendezvous. They'll be here, but just for a few hours, making the most of the rising tide in order to break free of the ocean and reach the river. This is the precise moment when the fishermen of Gironde set sail in pursuit of the Elva. The Elva is the juvenile of the eel that Sébastien has fished in the estuary's turbid waters for nearly 17 years. This tiny silverfish sells for a king's ransom of up to 800 euros a kilo. And for a few thousand elvas, this morning marks the end of an incredible migration.
Après le départ, pratiquement aussitôt après être né, quoi, à l'état de larve, et puis à mettre à peu près 1 an pour atteindre la côte atlantique. Et donc, entre-temps, elles se nourrissent et elles changent pour devenir les petits alevins qu'on voit, quoi.
Their adventure, however, begins on the other side of the world, off the Florida coast, in the remote Sargasso Sea. These eel larvae, only a few millimeters long, spontaneously respond to nature's mysterious call issued from the shores of Europe. Barely hatched from their eggs, they embark upon a transatlantic cruise of more than 6,000 kilometers, despite the fact that they can hardly move, much less swim. The only solution for these newborns is to ride the ocean motorway, quite simply drifting along on the Gulf Stream's current as they make their way back to their ancestral river. And these stowaways are not the only ones who benefit from this powerful current of tropical origin. During its northbound cruise, the Gulf Stream falls in love with the Norwegian peninsula and dallies on a string of islands with the lovely name of Lofoten. Oh, for the happiness of cod and those who fish them. Carl Victor christened his boat after himself, and each year at the same time he sails his namesake to the four corners of these islands. The miracle took place a few weeks earlier. Huge schools of scry, the Arctic cod, have kept their appointment on the shores of Norway.
Torsken han kommer hit for han har en gunstige vilkår for å formere seg og reprodusere seg. Så han har det gunstige temperaturer, det gunstige bunnforhold, og det er Golfstrømmen som tar ham med for de varme.
The trawler's first strikes are quite promising. Yet another occasion confirms how much larger Norwegian cod are than their Canadian cousins living across the Atlantic in the cold waters of Labrador. Cod fishing in the Lofotens is more than 1,000 years old and is still the island's principal livelihood. Carl Victor never fails to thank the current, without which human presence would have been impossible on this archipelago at the northmost edge of the Arctic Circle.
Ja, de er klar over det, for det har vi lært fra barneskolen, fra barnsben av. Da har vi bestandig lært at Golfstrømmen er veldig viktig for oss her, og det er jo en evig prosess, og det som gjør at vi kan ha en eksistens her.
But this eternal process could one day be interrupted. This dreadful hypothesis was recently confirmed in a discovery made by paleoclimatologists, those scientists who attempt to predict tomorrow's climate on the basis of the day before yesterday's. The basement of the Chateau of Gif-sur-Yvette contains the vault of the Laboratory of Climatic and Environmental Sciences. Although it looks more like a wine cellar, this is where the paleoclimatologists keep their priceless treasures. It houses kilometers of sediment core samples taken from the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Invaluable clues that after a brief game of hide-and-seek enable Elisabeth Michel and Jean-Claude Duplessis to closely study weather variations over the past 100,000 years. At first glance, the Earth's past climate seems to have followed a regular succession of cooling and warming cycles, which are visible to the naked eye in the different sediment layers.
Le gros travail qui a été fait pendant la seconde moitié du XXe siècle, ça a été d'étudier en détail cette succession de périodes froides et de périodes chaudes, notamment dans les sédiments marins. Et là, on a pu montrer que cette succession était quasiment périodique, avec des périodicités qu'on a pu déterminer de 20 000 ans, 41 000 ans et 100 000 ans.
However, in the early 90s, the discovery of a strange grey stone embedded in a sediment core extracted off the coast of France ended up toppling this beautiful theory.
Regarde, ces troncs sont 5. Donc, c'est un peu gros, donc c'est trop gros pour être transporté par le vent ou les courants. Donc ça a forcément été apporté par des icebergs. Et donc là, on est en plein milieu de l'océan Atlantique Nord, vers 50 degrés nord. Donc il faut imaginer une grande valse d'icebergs à ces périodes-là.
This story unfolded some 20,000 years ago during a major glacial era. Rapid and violent rises in temperature caused an accelerated melting of the immense ice cap that covered North America. This released thousands of icebergs into the Atlantic Ocean. Scientists might have gone on ignoring this ice breakup if these icebergs hadn't played at Tom Thumb, transporting pebbles from Canada's rocky soil and dropping them in the ocean floor off the coast of Europe.
On a des carottes du côté presque des côtes françaises, dans le golfe de Gascogne ou pas très loin de Gibraltar, où vous retrouvez les derniers cailloux qui ont fondu. Les cailloux déposés par les icebergs qui ont fondu, c'est pas les cailloux qui fondent. Tu le veux dessus?
These massive ice breakups were a most important discovery. They demonstrate that accidents in the form of abrupt heat waves have occurred in the immutable succession of warm periods and glacial eras, which have characterized the Earth's climate for the past few million years.
Ça pourrait être brusque, c'est brusque. Par exemple, on a pu montrer qu'un de ces réchauffements s'était produit en 70 ans. Donc vous aviez des hommes de Cro-Magnon qui sont nés dans un climat particulièrement désagréable et qui ont fini leur vie sur une chaise longue avec le climat de Nice.
In the cold storage rooms of the laboratory, glaciologists have evidence which validates this theory. Ice cores extracted from the Greenland ice cap enabled Valérie Masson to know the air temperature virtually year by year for the past 20,000 years. An analysis of air bubbles miraculously imprisoned in these ice cubes from another time confirms that sudden heat waves occurring during major glacial eras were responsible for these iceberg breakups. But most surprising is that these temperature rises were followed systematically by episodes of rapid and violent cooling in northern Europe.
On a des zones couvertes de banquises, de glace de mer qui sont beaucoup plus étendues qu'aujourd'hui, jusqu'au large de l'Espagne par moment. Au niveau de l'Europe de l'Ouest, ça correspond à des périodes de refroidissement très importantes, jusqu'à des latitudes comme la Dordogne. Pendant les phases les plus froides, on avait le sol qui était gelé en profondeur. Donc vraiment des épisodes de froid très intenses qui touchaient jusqu'au sud-ouest de la France.
But where did all those strange climatic ups and downs come from? Those alternating hot and cold waves that lasted only a few decades and left so many traces in the ice of Greenland. An American oceanographer was the first to solve the riddle. The American coast may have been snubbed by the Gulf Stream. Nevertheless, Wallace Broecker devoted 50 years of his life to this current. A professor at the prestigious Columbia University, Broecker was passionately committed to better understanding how the Earth's climate is determined primarily by ocean currents, and notably by those of the Gulf Stream.
Well, a Gulf Stream is a big heat machine that's taking tropical heat and carrying it into cold regions of the planet. So if you didn't have the Gulf Stream, it would be considerably cooler in Great Britain, France, Scandinavia.
Now we have a temperature of 42 degrees in both Newark and Central Park. Should be a nice day today. Sunny, high around 65 degrees.
Intrigued by the abrupt climate changes of the past, Wallace Broker imagined that the explanation lay in a dysfunction of this natural boiler that provides the European coast with a supplemental 10 degrees during the coldest seasons.
Well, we were faced with this mystery that the record in Greenland showed these jumps from very cold to intermediate cold, would stay there several hundred years and then jump back, and no one knew what this was. My idea was that what was happening during the glacial period is something was knocking out this conveyor system, and when it went off, the heat that it delivered to the northern Atlantic was shut down, and therefore that caused the great cooling in Europe.
The venerable professor then attempted to discover the origin of these sudden diversions of the Gulf Stream. The answer lies where this tropical current performs its deep-sea dive. When these warm, salty waters reach the Arctic Ocean, they release part of their heat into the atmosphere and into the cold waters they encounter. The result is evaporation, which increases the water's salinity and density. As they become colder and saltier, and therefore heavier, the tropical waters sink to the bottom of the sea, where they feed thermohaline circulation. These deep water formations constitute the primary engine of the ocean conveyor belt and the Gulf Stream. But if this fragile mechanism is disturbed, the entire system is likely to be interrupted. And this is precisely what happened during the last ice age.
It's the fresh water, the melting of the icebergs, the flow of water in from these floods that diluted the salt. Salt is a big densifier of seawater, so if you dilute it, you prevent deep water from forming, and that turns off the conveyor.
In short, over the course of the last glacial era, our planet experienced many abrupt temperature rises. Only a few degrees warming were all it took to cause the gigantic iceberg breakups and the infusion of 1 billion cubic meters of fresh water into the North Atlantic. The result was a decline in the density of the tropical waters and the interruption of deep water formations. Therefore, divert the Gulf Stream to the south and you cause a violent cold wave in northern Europe. This is what Professor Broker called the Achilles heel of ocean circulation.
I use the term Achilles heel of ocean circulation because if you disrupt a deep water formation in the northern Atlantic, you change everything. And if you shut down one of the ventilators, then it's going to happen somewhere else and reorganize the distribution of heat around the planet.
A half-century ago, Wallace Broker presented his Columbia University students with a hypothesis that for a long time was regarded as a harbinger of ill omen by the scientific community. As an obsession long judged as madness, our current global warming could easily be a replay of the disaster movie of the past.
Good, successful scientists do that. Some scientists doggedly stick to their old ideas and it destroys them. And she didn't get tenure at MIT, and she probably should have. During the glacial period, we know that there were times when the conveyor circulation stopped. This allowed ice to form everywhere north of Great Britain, and this made northern Europe like Siberia. It had extraordinarily cold winters, much, much, much colder than today. So the fear is that by warming the planet, we may induce another stop of this conveyor, and that would return us to an ice age.
Here, at the Weather Research Center in Toulouse, the laboratories of Météo France are the first to measure the warming of our planet. Powerful calculators are occupied during the day predicting the weather for the following days and spend their nights simulating the climate of centuries to come. Serge Planton, climate specialist for Météo France, participates in the work of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which has been charged by the UN with evaluating scientific data on global warming.
On sait que le climat a changé et on sait qu'il changera dans le futur, et en particulier il changera à cause des activités humaines, à cause des émissions des gaz à effet de serre.
For the first time in its history, mankind is influencing the Earth's climate. Even if this issue continues to be debated, mankind's responsibility for the warming of the planet is now accepted by the vast majority of the scientific community. Automobile pollution, industrial production, deforestation, and even certain agricultural sectors like livestock breeding are among the many human activities contributing to the increase of greenhouse gases, which are principally responsible for the new global warming. Take just one example. More than 6 billion tons of carbon dioxide are emitted into the atmosphere each year. If the current rate continues, this figure could reach 20 billion tons by the year 2050. And certainly development in emerging countries like China and India will not slow this pace. This information is enough to throw into disarray every computer simulation that attempts to forecast the climate of the future.
Les modèles les plus complexes simulent un réchauffement pour le prochain siècle. On ne parlera pas évidemment de prévision parce qu'il y a encore évidemment beaucoup d'incertitudes sur les scénarios d'émissions des gaz à effet de serre, ne serait-ce que là. Mais les projections qui sont faites suivant ces scénarios, c'est un réchauffement du climat qui, d'après la fourchette qui avait été donnée par l'IPCC en 2001, va de 1,5 à 6 degrés par rapport à 1990.
In any case, one thing is certain. This global warming is unprecedented in human history. And according to Serge Planton, the predictions of rising temperatures still have some surprises in store for us.
Par exemple, on pense que les canicules vont devenir de plus en plus fréquentes. Ne serait-ce qu'à l'échelle de la France, par exemple, on considère que d'après les scénarios les plus pessimistes, on pourrait avoir une augmentation des canicules d'un facteur peut-être de 5 à 10. Ça veut dire que l'été 2003 deviendrait un été normal finalement à la fin du XXIe siècle.
From this, one can easily conclude that the present warming trend could cause the ocean conveyor belt to shut down again. Twice a week, Lars makes reconnaissance flights over the southern tip of Greenland, patrolling the ice of Narsarsuaq. He carries out this mission in summer and winter alike in order to advise commercial vessels on the state of the ice barrier up and down the coast. And in the nearly 15 years that he has been crossing the skies of Greenland, Lars Erik Eriksen can testify only to the fact that the ice conditions have degraded throughout this Arctic region.
What we can hear and see for ourselves in a way is that the sea is open for a longer time every year before it's freezing totally in the areas where it should be solid ice. And so normally we should have solid ice on the west coast from the polar circuit and to the north. But nowadays the big ships can sail later on a longer distance. So something's changing in a way. If that has to do with the global warming or if it's a cycle normally, I don't know.
Scientists envision that the ice barrier will totally disappear in the summertime within the next 20 years. Added to this is the melting of the Greenland glacier, which is receding at a rate of 14 kilometers a year, 3 times faster than at the end of the 80s. But above all, there is the increase in rainfall throughout the Arctic and the flow of the rivers in North America and Asia, which are continuing to swell. This additional fresh water influx from many sources will very likely disrupt ocean circulation. Given the extent of the threat, oceanographers are taking turns at the Gulf Stream's bedside. For the past month, the Oceania has been plying the grey waters of the Greenland Sea. Aboard the Polish oceanographic ship, Jan Peciura and his team are determined to conduct a thorough search of these waters. For it is here, beyond the Arctic Circle, that the current suddenly decides to plunge to the ocean floor. The Oceania is on its 8th assignment. These round trips enable the crew to meticulously plot the salinity, currents and temperatures between the ocean's surface and its depths. The objective of this painstaking data collection is the observation of the slightest change in the tropical waters that reach this spot before setting out again southwards. Recently, a Norwegian team detected a drop in the salinity in the bottom return current of the Gulf Stream. But the Oceania's computers reveal yet another surprise.
W tym czasie obserwujemy znaczne zmiany wody atlantyckiej. Zasolenie mniej więcej utrzymuje się na takim samym poziomie. W 2004 temperatura wody atlantyckiej wzrosła. No i obecnie obserwujemy z tych badań, które dotychczas zrobiliśmy, że w tym roku jest jeszcze wyższa niż w roku poprzednim o około 0,7 stopnia Celsjusza.
A rise of nearly 1 degree, unprecedented in the history of oceanography.
Co łączy się z intensywniejszym zanikiem lodu morskiego, a to z kolei oznacza dopływ wody słodkiej do systemu i również osłabić to jedno z ogniw cyrkulacji termochalinowej.
The first effects of global warming on the North Atlantic are clearly detectable on the Oceania's data screens and in the ocean depths. So the inevitable question is, will global warming paradoxically sweep Europe towards a new ice age? This disaster scenario was conceived here in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, on the east coast of the United States.
The Gulf Stream is a marvelous thing. It's this very strong, powerful flow which controls a lot of things, for example, our climate. And so this is one thing which makes it an attractive place to study the Gulf Stream. It's close, and we can get there in a matter of one day.
Terry Joyce is a researcher at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, an independent laboratory created in 1930. For many years now, Terry has taken advantage of the nearby Gulf Stream to closely monitor his powerful neighbour for any sign of change. Like many at Woods Hole, he is convinced that according to this profile, any shutdown in thermohaline circulation could very well cause a new ice age.
If we have an abrupt shift and the Gulf Stream shifts to the south and the heat doesn't get north as it has in the past, we'll have typically winters like winter before last, where behind me was sea ice and it was very cold.
As for the probability of such cold waves returning to the North Atlantic, Terry Joyce is not much more reassuring.
Most people would feel the probability is very low that it can occur in the next decade, maybe 2%. Probability would be maybe 50% in 100 years.
Recently, the concerns of Terry Joyce and other scientists at Woods Hole were taken very seriously by a team of consultants at the Pentagon. In October 2003, Peter Schwartz and Doug Randall published a report titled An Abrupt Climate Change Scenario and Its Implication for the United States National Security. This 20-page report is something George Bush would surely prefer to keep secret, because despite its reassuring title, the contents are explosive. Convinced that an abrupt climate change is imminent, its authors imagine the unthinkable. The collapse of thermohaline circulation would take place around the year 2010. It would impose Siberian temperatures on Europe, with an increased scarcity of water resources accompanied by ever more frequent blizzards and gale-force winds. Schwartz and Randall also predict unprecedented food shortages for the continent, along with the southward migration of Scandinavian and Northern European populations in search of a little warmth. Elsewhere, the disrupted monsoon system would thrust China into chaos. Rising sea levels would lead to the near disappearance of Bangladesh, and an unrelenting drought would descend on East Africa. In the face of multiplying conflicts around the world, the United States, also affected by the cold wave, would adopt an isolationist policy, committing its resources to feeding its own population, reinforcing its borders, and so forth. As for the eventuality of such a scenario, rather than wondering if it will occur, the authors believe it's more a question of when. If the scientific community considers alarmist many points in this report, Terry Joyce is more moderate.
N'ont pas échappé à la tempête de neige, qualifiée outre-Atlantique d'historique.
This exercise was not a prediction. It was a worst-case scenario. Okay, what could happen? How big might it be? Let's take the biggest numbers that people think are reasonable, apply them, and say, how will this affect? During the period of the Cold War, when I was holding my hands over my head because we were afraid of nuclear obliteration, you know, these were real fears, but they were also based on scenarios.
Joyce credits the authors above all for finally showing an interest in the dramatic consequences that these abrupt climate changes hold for the entire planet.
If other pentagons in other countries or other think tanks in other countries are doing that sort of exercise, it would be good. Because as I mentioned, it's not just, if we have any kind of abrupt change, it's not just going to be something which will affect the third world. It's going to affect everyone.
Potsdam, just outside Berlin, is the home of a young climatologist, one of the world's specialists in predicting future climate scenarios. At the Albert Einstein Institute, in the same building once occupied by the inventor of relativity, Stefan Ramstorff pores over the climatic fluctuations of the future. In the Institute's basement, an army of computers work day and night digesting the scientific data fed to them. Information such as the speed of currents, salinity, air temperature, and the thickness of the ice cap. Enough material to project highly sophisticated calculations and to construct all sorts of hypotheses on the eventuality of a new shutdown of ocean circulation.
There is a threshold of how much fresh water you can add to the North Atlantic, and if you exceed that, the circulation will shut down. I think that as a worst case, we could cross the threshold within this century, in the second half of this century, if we do not stop the further global warming in time. The only thing we do know is that we are moving towards that threshold because the freshwater influx into the Atlantic is increasing and the salinity is already declining.
To establish this worrying forecast, Stefan Ramstorff factors into his parameters the melting of a major portion of the Greenland ice cap, namely 70% of the planet's freshwater reserves. A hypothesis judged likely if global warming continues on its crazy course. The result is a model that places us in a scenario for global climate change in the coming centuries, as though we were actually there. The shutdown of ocean circulation could, therefore, take place in the second half of our century, causing a cooling of North Europe. Extensive global warming would initially compensate for this loss of a few degrees. But this would be just a simple respite. Because as the year 2300 approaches, the exhaustion of fossil energies like oil and gas would mean a reduction of global warming, which would then allow the North Atlantic to cool.
In the long run, if carbon dioxide levels are reduced again in coming centuries, but the Atlantic circulation remains switched off, which is the situation that occurred in some model scenarios, then you can actually get a cooling of Europe by several degrees below current levels. That's still certainly not an ice age or so, but it would make agriculture in Scandinavia, for example, very difficult.
The German scenario may not herald the end of the world for tomorrow, but it does predict it for the day after that. Moreover, it predicts that abrupt changes quite as dramatic could well result from this new shutdown of the conveyor belt.
One thing we are pretty sure about is that this would lead to a major disruption of the ecosystems in the North Atlantic, which depend very strongly on the nutrient supply provided by these currents.
The consequences would be a slight aggravation of the fishing crisis everywhere in Europe, and the modification of fish breeding grounds, like those of the Arctic cod, which could then definitely desert the coast of Norway.
We know that the sea level around the North Atlantic coast would come up by about a meter in addition to the global mean sea level rise, simply because when the current changes, the surface of the Earth's ocean adjusts accordingly, and that means in this case sea level rise in the North Atlantic and dropping in the Southern Ocean.
Just 1 additional meter. That's all it takes to further threaten the densely populated coastlines of the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and even France. In Potsdam, some 500 kilometers from the sea, people seem to have realized the risk of climate change. The multitude of bicycles and trams attest to this. But that is not enough to reassure Stefan Ramstorff. He worries about the slow pace of political decisions, in particular those which would enable Europe to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by only 75% by the year 2050.
I think that the politicians haven't quite grasped the urgency of this problem yet. They pay lip service to it, but the measures that have been taken are pretty half-hearted, and really time is running out. We have perhaps another 10 years to really turn the tide and start this fundamental transition in our energy system towards a much higher efficiency, towards renewable energies. But if we lose another 10 years and do very little, then I am very worried about the future.
10 years to change the situation. 10 years to engage in this decisive battle against the warming of our planet, with plenty of threats to the generations to come.
My daughter is statistically going to live to the year 2100. This is what babies born in the last few years will do. And I am very concerned about the world that she will be living in, because if we do not tackle this problem in the next 10 years or so and really get serious about solving this, then I think by the end of the century we will not recognize this planet. It will be a completely different place, and I don't think it will be a very good place.
Industrial production represents only 1/4 of the emissions responsible for overheating our climate. Housing, transport, and everyday human activities make up the rest. Therefore, it is up to each of us to behave every day in such a way that we bequeath to future generations an Earth as viable as the one that we inherited. Like everywhere in the world, the countdown has begun along the coasts of Europe. No one can rule out a new shutdown of ocean circulation by the end of the century. Another climatic surprise in the already lengthy list of uncertainties that weigh on the climate of tomorrow. In any case, one thing's for certain. We have a time bomb ticking away in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's vital that we disarm it now. The Gulf of St. Lawrence on the Canadian coast, exactly across the Atlantic from the Bay of Dinard. In this early January, the temperature has dipped to minus 40 degrees and the thickness of the ice makes exiting Quebec Harbour a tricky business.
Northern Enterprise, déconseillé. C'est quand même assez clair. Il faudrait que vous gardiez le côté sud.
For 1 hour now, the icebreaker des Groseilliers has been labouring to free up the channel and the route out to sea. For many months to come, all ships plying the St. Lawrence will have to take this thick ice into account. And while the absence of the Gulf Stream may not be the only reason for these severe winters, its warm waters certainly would have altered the deal. Nevertheless, on their transatlantic voyage, these waters have quite simply ignored the Canadian shores. The Highlands on the northwest coast of Scotland. Latitude 57.8 degrees north. The same latitude as Hudson Bay, the kingdom of Canadian polar bears. Jean-François is a member of the Frigodems, amateur bathers who take to the sea in summer and winter alike, never missing an opportunity for a short swim in the Atlantic. A 20-minute dip, no matter what. This Sunday ritual would certainly be much harsher if it weren't for the relative mildness that bathes the Brittany coastline throughout the year. However, our retired postman has some notion of the current blessed by the gods that allows him to escape Sunday Mass.
C'est possible que ce soit grâce au Gulf Stream, qui passe quand même pas loin de Jersey, donc qui doit quand même réchauffer un peu les courants qui passent par là, quoi, à mon avis.
Mild winters, an ice-free sea, the passage of the warm Gulf Stream waters close to the Brittany coast explain in large part the famous microclimate touted in the region's tourist brochures. But one thing's for sure, there's no question of imitating the Frigodems on the other side of the Atlantic. Same time of year, same latitude. Winter 2060 off the coast of Brittany. A thick layer of ice impedes all navigation. All along the French coastline, many ports remain closed, waiting for the icebreaker's intervention. For the third time this year, most of Europe's airports have cancelled all flights, leaving thousands of planes grounded. From Norway to Spain, from Ireland to the Urals, all of Europe is affected by this unprecedented cold wave. Reality or fiction? These alarming predictions are part of a report recently commissioned by the American government, which seriously contemplates the breakdown of ocean currents and the European climate by the end of the 21st century. The cause of this disaster? It is to this barren and desolate place, the least hospitable in all of Britain, that the Gulf Stream has lovingly bestowed its most precious wedding gift.
This is a very interesting shrub, or large shrub, small tree. It's Euphorbia mellifera, and it comes from Madeira, places like that, and it's got this most beautiful, intoxicating smell. It smells like honey. This is Eucalyptus coccifera. You could almost imagine you was in Australia. As you can see there, we've got the Watsonias, which come from South Africa. Amazing to think we can grow Watsonias out. Beautiful.
Kevin Ball has one true passion, horticulture. And he's most fortunate indeed because he is in charge of one of Great Britain's most extraordinary gardens, the Inverewe Gardens. A botanical folly in the middle of nowhere, the Inverewe Gardens has assembled one of the richest collections of exotic plants in the world.
Although we are very north, we get the influence of the Gulf Stream, which brings
global warming. This foreseen catastrophe can be added to the litany of climatic accidents which have been multiplying over recent years. Torrential and devastating floods, deadly heat waves, increasingly frequent and violent hurricanes and typhoons. Enough examples to make us aware of the risk we run when we tamper with our climate. This time, the threat comes from the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, in the complexities of that most mythical of marine currents, the Gulf Stream. Saturday, December 31st on the Emerald Coast. With weather unfit to send a postman out into, even a retired one. But Jean-François Veillard, barely 1 week retired from the post office, is determined to venture out, and in his favourite uniform.